Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for tuning into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read part 1 of chapter 21 of the Tom Petty biography. I only do this occasionally. Chapter 21 is quite long, around 50 minutes based on my calculations. So I decided to split it into 2 different parts. I'll read part 1 this week and read part 2 next week. I was sick over the weekend. I'm not back to 100% yet, so please bear with me. Now, let's see what part 1 has in store for us. Lenny Waronker talked Petty and Rubin out of making Wildflowers a double album, instead pushing them to assemble something that would stand as one of the great releases of its time. It wasn't always obvious what songs should be included. This wasn't a collection of tracks fighting to be singles. It was an outpouring of moods, meditations, rants, rock and roll, poetry. The bigger decisions would come less in what should be included relative to a song's individual strength, and more in how those tracks sat against one another. What were the family traits? What songs had them? Petty was dogged in making as good a collection as he could, even if it meant leaving something off that might be a single. Even his okay songs are great, says George Draculis, who worked alongside Rick Rubin at the time. Poor guy, you know what I mean? Even decades later, Wildflowers tracks would emerge that seemed too good to have been left off. Rod Stewart recorded a version of one of them, Leave Virginia Alone. Ryan Olyate, the band's current co-producer, confidant, and musical archivist, played some of the others for Petty and Mike Campbell in 2013. Certain cuts Petty remembered, but he had no memory at all of Somewhere Under Heaven. A beautiful recording. It came from a time when such things were lying all around the room, piling up one on another. Heartbreakers appeared on Saturday Night Live to promote the release of Wildflowers. Dave Grohl sat behind the drum kit. The Foo Fighters were still only an idea in the back of Grohl's mind, what he hoped would be an outlet for songs he had written that were otherwise homeless. It made sense to see the Nirvana drummer up there as the Heartbreakers played You Don't Know How It Feels and Honey Bee. Rock and roll had become a smaller club. The very idea of a band, once the fundamental unit for music making, was just another category among many. But if you were raised during the British invasion or the punk years, a band was everything, a shield and a shelter. That was no longer true for all kids in the late 20th century. In their ways of thinking, Petty and Grohl belonged to what would soon have to be acknowledged as a passing age. Grohl made his brief stop in the Heartbreakers as a figure of enthusiasm and light. But it was clear enough to Petty that Grohl had something he needed to go do, a band he needed to form. So Petty put in a call to Steve Barone. I was in Germany working with Brian Ferry, the drummer says. I got a message from my girlfriend who said that Tom had called, that the album was finished. I thought, wonder what that's about. So I called him and he said, what are you doing next week? Want to go on the road with me? It was exactly what I wanted to do, but I thought he was going out with the Heartbreakers. So I asked, what about Stan? And he said, well, we've been having our differences. I asked if he had spoken to Stan about this, because, I've been in a band and know what it's like. He said that, no, he hadn't discussed it with Stan. I said, well, put it this way. I'm really flattered that you called me, and I'd love to do it, but you should talk to Stan first and just see where you are with that stuff. You've been together such a long time. 2 days later, my phone rang, and it was Tom saying, "You're working next week." Verone knew nothing of the bridge school shows, just as he knew nothing of Petty's efforts to enlist Lynch for the Wildflowers tour. But there was too much to start trying to explain to Verone. It was either a 1-minute conversation, stands out, "Do you want to be in?" or a 3-hour walk into anger, frustration, and what could only be a subjective account of years of hurt feelings and misunderstanding. Verone was in. He could hear all the bull later. Elvis Costello and the Attractions, Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, Graham Parker and the Rumor, or Billy Joel and the guys who played with him for a long time and left, really pissed off. They were a class of artists who came up in the Confession and Quiet of the early 70s singer-songwriters, but got off on the energy of punk rock released. Guys who wanted both the intimacy of the folk singers and the powerful live shows of early rock and roll. They wanted it both ways, but didn't always have an easy time keeping their bands together. If they could carry on without those bands when the burdens of leadership got to be too much, they generally did exactly that. Sometimes a man knows when he just can't see the bass player's face in the hotel lobby one more morning. The problem is, when he lets that bass player go, the troubles are often out there among the fans. The kids who bought the records, the ones who believe from the beginning, they don't want to see Mick Jagger or any other band leader take up with another group. They've been asked to make an investment in an idea, and they did it. There isn't an off switch for their commitment to that original band. And as it turns out, the fans have more power than they know. As a collective, they have the governing vote. Springsteen released Human Touch and Lucky Town in 1992, left the E Street Band, and recorded and went on the road with new players. But it was clear that his audience didn't approve of this latest fling. They liked to see Springsteen backed by the guys who knew him win. If inadvertently, Lucky Town and Human Touch were public reminders of what bands meant to the fans who had invested in them, ever since the Beatles transformed and deepened the concept. A band wasn't a group of backing musicians. That was something else, even if it went by the same name. More than his peers, Petty remained aware of what a band meant, and of the history to which the idea was attached. It was being in a band that had made this world a habitable place for Tom Petty, and he stuck at building one long enough for that rarest thing to transpire. His group found a sound all their own. Even the finest musicians could come together without achieving that result. It typically took years, and even then happened infrequently. The Beatles and the Stones got there. The Heartbreakers did too. Most of their peers didn't. They lost patience or couldn't manage it. But with the Heartbreakers, there was something in the way Mike Campbell and Petty played together, in the way Benmont Tench and Mike Campbell found melodic spaces without the place getting overcrowded, in the way those three together landed on a Petty original. That was the center. They weren't the sole architects, but they were the sine qua non of the Heartbreakers sound. Whatever went on with Petty's adventures as a solo artist, he'd never stray far from that. The idea of a solo record? Possible. The idea of a solo tour? Never. The Wildflowers tour, as with every tour before and after, was a Heartbreakers event. By the time the band was on the road, it was clear that Wildflowers was going to be a big record for Petty. It sold 2 million copies within just a few months. When Wildflowers came out, says Rick Rubin, and it did as well as it did, and it did really well. I remember being a little surprised. And I think the reason I was surprised has to do with the idea of a grown-up making a good record. there were so few grown-ups making good records that it really stood out for just that reason. When you think of the great songwriters, they weren't making great albums at that point. I can't remember what Paul Simon record or what Paul McCartney record came out around that time, but I'm guessing they just weren't as good. Wildflowers had a lot of good songs. I knew there were enough to make a great double album. It didn't have to be, but we had the quality to do it. It's a really special record. If Long After Dark was an album in which Petty looked into the troubled places beyond love's gilded entryway, Wildflowers was something else. One man's open journal of love's demise and the dream of more. It was equally direct and fiercely personal, but often quieter. Time to move on, time to get going. What lies ahead, I have no way of knowing. There's a stark, distilled poetry to the lyrics and an almost unnerving openness. In Don't Fade on Me, Petty speaks to someone with whom he could no longer speak. I remember you so clearly, the first one through the door, and I returned to find you drifting too far from the shore. I remember feeling this way. You can lose it without knowing. You wake up and you don't notice which way the wind is blowing. To Find a Friend begins as a more comedic playlet, a character-driven song that steps back from the intimacy of Don't Fade on Me. But even there, Petty becomes the man in the song, as though he's rehearsing some future moment, trying to see where things will land in his own life, or if they will. In the middle of his life, left his wife, and went off to be bad. Boy, it was sad. He bought a new car, found a new bar, went under another name, created a whole new game. And the days went by like paper in the wind. Everything changed, then changed again. It's hard to find a friend. Hard to find a friend. It all made for what was possibly the best album of his career. But for the family at home, it could have been seen as a betrayal. What Petty could do in the songs, he couldn't do in his life. No one called it betrayal, of course. The family had learned to live with it, found a way to see it as something else. They just called it songwriting. But any of its openness was reserved for the art, and it left little, if anything, for his family. It would have made no difference anyway. But the discrepancy between the world of songs, where things were talked about, addressed, and explored, and the world at home would wear on Petty, would break him, and a few of those around him. The firing of Stan Lynch was in some ways the first round, practice in doing the unthinkable. Petty had been with Lynch almost as long as he had been married to Jane Benyo, and the drummer had been, in Bugs Whitell's words, so much a part of the vibe and the identity of the Heartbreakers. But when Lynch was let go, the mail still came through the same slot at the same time. Tickets got sold, songs got written, records were made, gossip leaked into the atmosphere, but didn't become headlines. Petty's anxieties had exaggerated what Lynch's firing might mean to the stability of his band, to the fans. Lynch went his way, and perhaps not surprisingly, the two men had little to say about each other that wasn't underpinned by anger and disappointment. But everyone landed in a room with a soft bed, where a window revealed the sun coming up the next morning. It could be done. Somewhere inside, that's what Petty needed to see. He was as ready as he'd ever be. In ways, I see those relationships in similar light, says Petty, because they both lasted about the same amount of time, and through the same years of change, dramatic change, that affected all of our lives. We all started as kids, didn't even show up on anyone's radar. Then things got moving so fast, I'm not sure anyone was having an easy time keeping up. Everything kept getting bigger around us, but we stayed the same size. You could get a little lost in your new clothes, and we all did to some degree. One relationship was in a band, and one was in a family. which makes them as different as they are similar. But they were both decisions I put off making that I kicked myself for. I knew I was going to make this decision, and I didn't act on it. But when the Wildflowers touring came to a close, he did. With Jane, there was some bargaining at the end, prolonging the inevitable. He'd stay through Christmas, that kind of thing, but the theater of the marriage, and that's what it had become, was over. Soon enough, the bargaining was over too. I've read that Echo is my divorce album, says Petty, but Wildflowers is the divorce album. That's me getting ready to leave. I don't even know how conscious I was of it when I was writing it. I don't go into this stuff with elaborate plans, but I'm positive that's what Wildflowers is. It just took me getting up the guts to leave this huge empire that we had built, to walk out. My kids, I knew this was going to be devastating to the whole family. I was leaving them there, without me to balance things out. My kids knew that a nightmare was coming. Adria was already out of the house, but Anakim was just entering her teens. But staying there was finishing me off. I had become a different person. After Petty's therapist heard the song Wildflowers, he asked who the singer was addressing. I told him I wasn't sure, Petty says, and then he said, I know. That song is about you. That's you singing to yourself what you needed to hear. It kind of knocked me back, but I realized he was right. It was me singing to me. Petty moved into the house in Pacific Palisades, the chicken shack. It was really cool, says Rick Rubin, like a little log cabin on a lot of land. Going there was like stepping back in time to a hunting lodge or something. The house was all wood, not modern, with giant trees, redwoods, I think, all around. If Levon Helm walked in, you wouldn't think twice. But Petty didn't know how to set up a home for himself. He went to the supermarket, but didn't know how to shop for food, because that hadn't been a part of his adult life. It was as if he didn't have a point of reference for everyday activities. For their part, the band members, back from the Wildflowers tour, were off in their own lives. The Heartbreakers weren't holding hands and asking about one another's feelings. That just wasn't the culture that had been established. Bugs Wydell and Scott Thurston may have known more than anyone else about Petty's struggles, but that didn't mean that either man felt like there was a lot he could do beyond listening. This was the boss, and that was his life. I went over to the house in Pacific Palisades, says Stevie Nicks. I could get there quickly because I was 15 minutes away in Santa Monica. It was a beautiful house. You wouldn't have even imagined it was there. It was almost like a bird sanctuary. He was alone. Jane had been such a huge personality. She was one of those women that, when she was in the room, there was no one else there. And so all of a sudden, he's in this really nice, beautiful, small house with all these birds everywhere, but alone. It could have been a place for new beginnings, and surely that was the idea at the outset. But it never became that. It was instead a place of endings and isolation, of being lost in one's own creation. I left, but then I had this huge realization of what had happened, says Petty. There was terrible pain and guilt, as I guess comes to anybody who leaves a family. But I didn't foresee the storm that was going to come my way when I left. I thought it would be more like, okay, the door has finally been shut. That's the end of it. But that ain't the way it happens. Anakim didn't know what to do. I took her in, and she stayed for about a month. But it would be like, look, I have to go to the studio. Do you want to come to the studio with me? She'd say, no, I'd rather stay here. But I had to realize that I couldn't live with this kid and just leave her all alone when I had to do something. Anakim was right in the middle. It was so painful. By that time, Petty wasn't going to the studio. wasn't even getting out of bed on some days. Anakim was already gone. My sister was with my dad for maybe a month, explains Adria Petty. Then she was with me. And there was a long time when I was really angry with him. I was 21, and Anakim was 14 or 15. I got her into a school in Boston, but she got kicked out and came to live with me in Greenwich Village. I drove her to school every day, took care of her for a long time, which created problems between me and him. But by that time, Petty had fallen into a clinical depression. In Adria's words, he just couldn't get up. Jane, getting closer to the point at which those around her recognized that her problems went beyond drugs and alcohol, was sliding into a mental illness that had in fact held her down for years. No one was getting the help they needed. They were caught behind closed doors. The human condition is the same for everyone, says Olivia Harrison, but once you're isolated, it's even worse. When those big life events happen, you can't see your way out of them. When you're in the world, you have outreach. But when you're in a bubble, how do you see outside of that? And then you feel like you really don't want people to see what your troubles are. You're so private at that point. It's really easy to not get help. The boundaries Petty had set up with his band and crew, which helped keep the Heartbreakers going as an enterprise, became the walls that kept friends away when he could have used them. And for some people who had been around Tom and Jane for years, it would be hard to adjust to the end of their marriage, no matter how far down it had gone. I didn't discuss it with anyone, says Petty, so no one knew. Even George Harrison didn't know. I didn't talk to him much about that, says Petty, and then when I moved out, he called me up and said, "Are you sure you know what you're doing here?" I said, "Yes, I do. You don't know anything about what I've been through here. I have to do this." He said, "Well, I've come around to really liking Jane." After we split up, he went to see her a few times, sent her some letters and stuff, but he didn't know. Tom and Jane had been there long enough that people used them in that way, as something permanent amid the flux. I didn't realize, says Olivia Harrison, how difficult it would have been in that marriage. I think that Tom did try to keep his family together and did a good job making it seem like it was all working. Had he not been a musician and had his music and his studio and his songwriting, it probably would have fallen apart a lot sooner. You can always go sit down, play a song, and sort of put your head in the sand and express yourself. My mother was a really soulful, gregarious, fun person, says Adria Petty, and she loved him so much and had so much pride in his success. At the same time, she was very insecure, very resentful, very unclear about her place in the world. She also suffered from mental illness, and being married to someone who is mentally ill for a long time is really painful, and isn't the kind of thing you can do a soundbite on. It's not neatly tied up with a bow. My mom could be a mean person. She'd been really verbally cruel to my dad, had disregard for all three of us, way before they were even on the verge of divorce. I think my dad's reticence to admit that there was a problem there was so prolonged and sort of avoided by continual success. I think that only when I went to college did it become more obvious that he was in the house with someone who was unwell. I just hated watching what she did to him. Adria and Anakim Petty were quickly cast into the middle in a powerful, poisonous stream of anger and resentment. Petty left because things were bad, but then they got worse. Stevie Nicks tried to get Petty to write with her in an effort to distract him from his pain. I said, "Let's just write some songs. I don't write songs with anyone, and really, neither do you. Let's write some." He said, "Well, okay, maybe." So I went home thinking, I'm going to go there every day until 6 at night, and we're going to write. The next day, I arrived with my grocery bags with like Hershey chocolate syrup, instant coffee, and the kind of milk that I like. He's looking at me like I'm crazy. I say, I'm gonna be here, so I need my supplies. He's like, your supplies? I say, supplies, like when you go camping. I'll never forget, just because of the look on his face. It didn't really work out. And really, I knew it wouldn't. So I said, okay, so we're not going to write songs together, but I'll come visit you and I'll keep in touch. But also by that time, Dana had come into the picture. Petty had seen Dana York at a show in Texas in the early 90s, but that was it. He had only seen her. But her face, I remembered her face, Petty says, and that night, when I fell asleep, I had a dream, and I saw her so clearly. The following night, Petty was at the hotel after an Austin show, where there was a party in the lounge. Dana, there with her husband, himself a musician, and like her, a lifelong rock and roll fan, came up and introduced herself. It zapped my brain. Like, this is the girl I dreamed about last night. But there was no real conversation, other than when she said, I'm Dana. And I said, of course you are. Petty and York would run into each other on tours, Dana there with her husband. Some in the Heartbreakers camp picked up on the energy, and some of them didn't like it. However many problems Jane had brought into the band leader's life, they were used to Jane. But this wasn't the band, or the crew's, or the kids' decision to make. When Petty saw Dana at a Johnny Cash show in Los Angeles in 1996, she was no longer married, and neither was Petty. I felt like I had known him my whole life, recalls Dana Petty. I got her number at that Cash show, Petty explains, and I was calling her, and finally convinced her to come back to L.A. on a weekend when she didn't have her son Dylan. I thought she was the most beautiful, wonderful thing in the world. And we started seeing each other. And really, I was so deep in the trouble because of my family life falling apart. She was kind of my release from that. Every few weeks, she'd come out. But two things were happening at that time. I was falling apart, and I was falling in love. It can happen like that. But the fact was, Dana didn't know how up I was. I mean, I didn't know. York didn't move to Los Angeles until a year or so after the Cash show, by which time Petty, in therapy more regularly, but struggling to keep the darkness at bay, had started doing heroin. He kept it from her, from most everyone. Well, that wraps up part 1. Like I said, stay tuned for part 2 next week. Let me know what you thought of part 1 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.